They say every American town has its secret. Some are buried in old newspapers, some in family Bibles tucked behind loose walls, and some, like what happened in Kentucky in 1937, were buried in plain sight. You could drive through that part of the bluegrass state today, past the faded barns and the quiet fields where fog clings low to the ground, and you'd never guess what the soil remembers. Because what the soil remembers, the living have tried very hard to forget. It began with photographs. Black and white, grainy, and wrong. Faces that didn't look real. Faces twisted, melted, malformed, as though God himself had turned away before finishing his work. For decades, those photographs were said to be lost. Destroyed in a courthouse fire. But that wasn't true. Someone kept them. Someone hid them. And in 1972, when a retired archivist passed away in Bowling Green, they were found, tied together with twine, wrapped in the torn lining of a tobacco sack. Inside were 27 portraits. Men, women, and children. All from the same county. All from the same year, 1937. But these weren't the poor coal miners' families you'd expect to see in Depression-era Kentucky. They were something else. People with faces that doctors refused to photograph. People that hospitals refused to record. People who were, officially, never born. The state called them non-viable. The church called them God's punishment. The locals just called them the hollow ones. In 1937, a flood swept through the Ohio River Valley, one of the worst in American history. Entire towns were swallowed by water. And in that chaos, something surfaced. When the National Guard came through to rescue families trapped in the hills outside of Hazard, they reported finding cabins filled with people who wouldn't come to the door. People who covered their windows with tar paper. People who, when the floodwaters reached their porches, simply disappeared into the woods. The soldiers thought it was fear. Poverty. Isolation. But when one medic followed a trail of footprints into the trees, what he found made him vomit before he could even speak. There were families living together, generations deep, their skin pale and blistered like candle wax, their mouths sunken, their eyes strangely round, reflecting light like an animal's. The flood had exposed them, literally washed away the dirt and brush that had hidden their homes. And for a brief moment in American history, the secret faces of the Kentucky hills were seen by the outside world. The government called it a medical anomaly. The locals called it what happens when you marry your own blood. But it wasn't that simple. Because someone, somewhere, knew about them long before 1937. Those faces, the ones found in that tobacco sack in 1972, they weren't the only ones ever taken. A handful had already been quietly archived, mislabeled under public health, malnutrition studies. They were part of a federal project, one that began in 1929 under the Office of Rural Sanitation. The mission was simple: document the physical and genetic state of Appalachian families, for the sake of public health improvement. But what they didn't publish was what they found in the photographs. Entire bloodlines that had somehow changed. Families whose features shifted generation after generation, as though something was rewriting them from the inside out. One researcher, Dr. Meredith Clay, wrote in her field notes, "There is a pattern here that cannot be explained by malnutrition or isolation. Their skeletal deformities are not inherited, they are developing." She disappeared in 1938. Locals said she went back to the hills, to live among them. The official report says she drowned in the river. But no body was ever found. For decades after, rumors spread through small Kentucky towns, whispers of families that came down from the mountains at night to steal food, of children born with their eyes sealed shut, of strangers appearing at funerals to collect the bloodline. Farmers told stories of hearing laughter echoing from the woods after dark. Not the kind of laughter that comes from joy, but something forced, wet, like air bubbling through mud. And yet, when people tried to report it, they were told to stop. The local sheriff's office destroyed files. Hospital records were purged. Census names were erased. It was as though the hollow ones had been deleted from history. But the photographs, the ones the archivist hid, were proof. Proof that in 1937, Kentucky saw something that terrified the nation so deeply that the nation decided to pretend it never happened. When you look at the faces in those photographs, there's something in the eyes that feels wrong. Not monstrous. Not human either. It's like staring into a reflection that's almost you, but not quite. Some say it's what happens when bloodlines are kept too pure for too long. Others believe it was environmental, chemicals from the coal mines poisoning the water. But there's another theory, one so disturbing that it was blacklisted from publication. That what happened in those hills wasn't caused by nature, but by experiment. During the Great Depression, the federal government launched several public health studies across rural America. Most of them were genuine attempts to combat poverty. But a few, funded by private industrial backers, had darker motives. In the archives of the University of Louisville, there's a letter from 1936 signed only with the initials, RAC. It references the Clay families of Breathitt County, and states, specimens viable for continuation. Human morphology beyond expectation. Continue isolation. Specimens. Viable. Morphology. Those are not words a public health worker would use. And the Clay family, the same surname as the missing researcher, appeared multiple times in censuses until 1937. Then vanished completely. If you ask the older folks in those counties today, they'll tell you in whispers, the Clays were taken by the flood. But the truth is, not all of them were. Some lived. Some were moved. To where, no one knows. In 1941, a construction crew digging near an abandoned coal shaft in Leslie County unearthed what they thought were human remains. But the bones didn't match. The skulls were too small, the jaws too long, the eye sockets too wide. The bones were taken by the University of Kentucky for further study. No official record of those studies exists. Every few years, someone rediscovers the story. A journalist writes a blog post. A ghost hunter uploads a shaky video claiming to have found the deformed people of Kentucky. But they never get far. Accounts vanish. Links go dead. And the ones who do find something real, who publish the photos, either take them down, or disappear. The last person to publicly release one of those images was an amateur historian named Samuel Dent in 2014. He uploaded a single photo to an online forum, a group of children, barefoot, standing in front of a cabin. Their faces, blurred. But not from the camera. Their skin looked stretched, pulled too tight around the skull, their eyes too far apart. Within 48 hours, the image was gone. His account deleted. A month later, his obituary appeared in the Lexington Herald. Cause of death, undetermined. The caption under that photo read only 3 words, the hollow remember. And that's where this story begins, because in the archives Dent was studying, there was a final page, handwritten, dated February 1937. It was unsigned, but the handwriting matches that of Dr. Meredith Clay. It said, "They're not deformed. They're adapting. And we're the ones who changed first." The page ends there. When people speak about the hollow ones now, it's as folklore, an Appalachian ghost story whispered around campfires. But the further you look into it, the more the folklore starts to sound like a confession. A quiet apology passed down through generations for something unspeakable. After 1937, the government declared the entire area surrounding the flooded valleys uninhabitable. The official reason was water contamination. Unofficially, soldiers were sent to burn what remained. Cabins, barns, even wells were destroyed. The bodies were never recovered, or if they were, no one talked about them again. But the photographs survived. Someone always keeps the truth, even when it's dangerous. Especially when it's dangerous. When you study the faces closely, you start noticing something impossible. Their deformities follow a pattern. It's not random. The shape of the skulls, the elongation of the eyes, the structure of the cheekbones, it's progressive, generation by generation. The earliest photographs, dated around 1910, show subtle differences, a slightly broader forehead, eyes with a strange reflective quality. By the 1930s, the faces look almost alien. The hollow ones weren't degenerating. They were evolving. In the 1940s, a small group of researchers from Vanderbilt University received federal grants to study what they called cryptic rural morphologies. None of their work was ever published. But fragments of correspondence remain, letters between doctors and government officials discussing sustained adaptation to subterrestrial environments. Subterrestrial. Underground. And if that sounds far-fetched, consider this: beneath those Kentucky hills lie miles of abandoned mine shafts, caverns so deep they were never mapped. Locals swear that after the flood, when everything above ground was washed away, strange lights appeared in those caves, flickering lanterns far below the earth, long after the miners were gone. By the 1950s, the area was sealed off completely. New roads rerouted travelers away from the hollow's. Old property deeds were quietly bought out by companies that never listed a name, only numbers. Even the U.S. Geological Survey maps from the era show blank spaces where entire communities used to be. It's as though someone wanted to erase every trace of them, every photograph, every grave, every whisper of who they were. But the more you erase something, the deeper it sinks into the earth. A retired geologist, Walter Rees, once claimed he entered one of those sealed shafts in 1963. He said he followed a stream underground for nearly half a mile before coming across a carved wall, a human handprint pressed into stone, fused as if the rock itself had melted around it. He described the fingers as too long, too soft. Rees was never seen again after giving that interview. To the outside world, these stories sound like madness. But to the locals, they're warnings. There's a phrase people still whisper in parts of Breathitt and Leslie County. They say, the hollow remembers what the river took. Old men claim that when the fog rolls too thick in the valley, you can still hear the voices, children singing from somewhere beneath the waterline. Not words, just sound. Low, humming. Like something calling home. And it's not just ghost stories. There are sightings. Always the same description: pale figures glimpsed at dusk, standing at the edge of the tree line, watching. Too still. Too silent. No one ever sees them move, but when you look away, they're gone. Some hunters swear they've found footprints in the mud, smaller than a man's but longer, with an extra joint in the toe. One photo circulated online for a few hours before disappearing. It showed a child's handprint on a windowpane, the fingers too thin, the spacing off by just enough to make your stomach twist. Maybe it's easy to dismiss all this as folklore. It's comforting to believe these are just stories told to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods. But there's one problem with that. The science doesn't lie. In 2004, soil samples taken from the old floodplain revealed traces of heavy metals, arsenic, lead, and mercury, in concentrations far higher than any mining operation could account for. Something else had been dumped there, long before the flood. Military records from Fort Knox, less than 200 miles away, confirmed that biological material disposal took place in that region between 1931 and 1935. What kind of biological material would need to be buried in secret? If you connect the dates, the answer stares you in the face. The deformities began appearing in families closest to the disposal sites around 1932. By 1937, the flood spread those toxins throughout the valley, and the faces changed faster than nature should allow. Some believe the hollow ones weren't born from inbreeding or divine punishment, but from contamination. A test that went wrong. And yet, the Clay family's field notes suggest something else. That what changed them wasn't just physical, it was cognitive. There are reports of individuals from those hills demonstrating heightened sensitivity to light, to sound, even to movement underground. As though their senses had adapted to the darkness. Maybe they didn't die when the flood came. Maybe they simply went deeper. There's a story passed down through a handful of families that still live near the edge of the old floodplain. A story about a winter night in 1942, when a man's cattle started disappearing. He followed the tracks into the woods, carrying a lantern. He never came back. But the next morning, his wife found the lantern on their porch, still burning. And inside, behind the glass, was a single muddy handprint. Too long. Too soft. Over the years, the story changed. The cattle became chickens, then dogs, then people. But the handprint remained. Always the handprint. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you hide it? Or would you dig until you found what the world tried to bury? Because that's what this story really is, a buried truth. When the archivist's photographs resurfaced in 1972, they didn't just show deformity. In one of them, in the corner of the frame, there's a hand resting on a child's shoulder. Only the hand doesn't look right. It's blurred, warped, almost transparent. Like it wasn't captured by the camera properly. Experts dismissed it as motion blur. But if you look closely, you'll see that the rest of the photo is perfectly still. Only that hand seems to shift. And that child, the one with the hand on their shoulder, appears in 3 different photographs taken years apart. They don't age. Some people believe it's a mistake, a double exposure. Others say the child never left those hills. That they're still down there. That the hollow ones are waiting. Waiting for the rest of us to change like they did. Because maybe that's what Dr. Clay meant when she wrote, "We're the ones who changed first." Maybe the deformities weren't a curse. Maybe they were a reflection. A glimpse of what's coming. There's a silence that lives in the Kentucky hills. Not the kind you notice, but the kind that notices you back. If you've ever stood at the edge of those woods at night, you know it. That feeling that something is listening, just beyond the tree line. Something patient. Something that remembers. By the 1980s, most of the floodplain had been reclaimed by nature. The government declared the area safe again, though no one moved back. The families that once lived there had scattered, changed their names, started over. But even now, every once in a while, someone finds something that shouldn't be there. A bone where the soil is too young. A carving inside a cave where no carving tools could reach. And, more disturbingly, faces. In 1991, a wildlife photographer hiking near the Redbird River developed a roll of film that showed what he thought was a trick of the light, a pale figure standing among the trees, watching him. When he looked closer, he realized it wasn't a person at all. The eyes were too wide, the skin too thin, stretched tight across the skull like paper. The negatives were confiscated by state officials under wildlife safety regulations. The photographer left Kentucky a week later and never returned. He told a friend, years later, it wasn't an animal. It wasn't a man. It was something that looked at me like it recognized me. That's the part people always forget. Recognition. The hollow ones didn't just hide, they watched. And when they looked at the people who came to find them, they didn't look with fear. They looked with memory. By the early 2000s, strange recordings began circulating online. Faint sounds captured in the Appalachian backwoods, murmurs, chanting, what some described as echoed breathing. In one recording, if you listen closely, you can hear a woman's voice, whispering something that repeats every few seconds. It sounds like, "Come down, come down." The origin of the tape was traced to a group of spelunkers exploring a sealed shaft near the old floodplain. They never uploaded again. In 2016, an anonymous user posted a series of photos to an underground history forum. The images showed a small collection of artifacts allegedly recovered from an old mining tunnel, handmade dolls, carved from river clay, with faces too detailed for their size. The eyes were hollow, but the mouths were stitched shut with wire. Attached was a note written on aged paper, "They're still learning to speak." The post vanished within hours. But not before being archived. If you piece everything together, the photographs, the field notes, the bones, the handprints, it forms a kind of story, but not the kind you read. It's one that's written in generations, in mutations, in silence. A story that began when something poisonous entered the soil and something older answered back. There's an idea in Appalachian folklore that certain lands remember trauma. That when enough suffering happens in one place, the ground itself starts to echo it, replaying it in the form of ghosts, voices, or something stranger. Maybe the hollow ones aren't ghosts at all. Maybe they're what happens when the land tries to heal itself, and gets it wrong. But here's the part that doesn't fit neatly into science or superstition. Every recorded family that lived in the 1937 flood zone has descendants alive today. Most of them live ordinary lives, far from Kentucky. They don't talk about their grandparents. Some don't even know who they were. But every so often, one of them sends a letter to a local historian or a small museum. The letters all sound the same. They say things like, "I dream of water rising to my chin. I see faces when I close my eyes. My son was born with a small indentation under his ribs, shaped like a hand. Doctors call it coincidence. Trauma passed through blood." But when enough coincidences pile up, you stop calling it that. In one letter dated 2019, a woman from Illinois wrote, "My grandmother warned us never to say our real name in the dark. She said the hollow ones remember who they belong to. No one knows how the story truly ends. The records are too fragmented, too deliberately erased." The state archives still deny the existence of the hollow photographs, though private collectors whisper that a few originals are still out there, locked in basements, traded in secret. One collector, who requested anonymity, described one image he swore was genuine. It showed a young woman standing beside a well. Her face is half lit by the flash, half lost in shadow. But in that darkness, barely visible, is another face, pressed against her shoulder, smaller, half-formed, smiling. When asked what he did with the photo, he said, "I burned it. But the smile stayed with me." You might think this is where the story fades into legend, but it doesn't. Because every few years, new evidence surfaces, like the earth refuses to keep its secret buried. People hear things in those hills, drips of water that sound like breathing, echoes that answer when you speak. And then there's the last note from Dr. Clay. Not the one found in 1937, the other one. It was discovered in 1989, inside a sealed metal case at the University of Louisville. The handwriting is unmistakably hers. It says, "The flood didn't wash them away. It washed us closer." Underneath it, a single line scratched into the paper with something sharp. Listen. The hollow is still growing. That's where the file ends. No explanation. No location. Just that one word, growing. Maybe the hollow ones were never monsters. Maybe they were warnings. A glimpse of what happens when we bury our mistakes deep enough for the earth to remember them. And maybe that's why no one wants to talk about Kentucky, 1937. Not because it's history, but because it isn't. So if you ever find yourself driving those back roads late at night, and the fog starts to thicken, don't stop the car. Don't listen to the voices that sound like someone you know. Don't follow the light that flickers in the trees. Because some secrets in this country aren't forgotten. They're waiting. And the hollow remembers.